Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great honor to welcome you all to the third international conference of the journal Scuola Democratica. Today, we have the privilege of hearing from a prominent scholar in the field of sociology of education, whose work has influenced the scientific debate on the relationship between the educational field and social inequalities. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Agnès van Zanten, who has, as you will know, is a senior research professor working for the French National Center for Scientific Research at the Center for Research on the Social Inequalities of Sciences Po in Paris. Agnès van Zanten has made significant contributions to highlighting critical issues in social justice, particularly through her exploration of educational inequalities and the processes of social reproduction in education system. She has authored and co-authored many influential publications, including Choisir son école, Stratégie familiale et médiation locale, considered a seminal work in France and beyond, which delves deep into the processes of school choice by middle-class parents in particular, and school segregation. She has also focused on the role of elites in shaping educational institutions and outcomes. Her work addresses how elite schools function and how they contribute to the perpetuation of social hierarchies. In this regard, we'll recall the book she edited for Routledge, Elites in Education, a reference work on the socio-political and cultural implications of the provision and consumption of elite education. And Elites, Privilege and Excellence, the national and global redefinition of educational advantage, with Stephen Ball and Brigitte Darchy-Coquelin, focused on how elite education reinforces the advantages of already privileged groups at the national and global levels. Today, Professor van Zanten will present a speech entitled Education-Based Mobility in the 21st Century, Barriers and Opportunities in a Market-Based Meritocracy. There will be a chance for asking questions and making comments later. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Agnès van Zanten, who we thank you for accepting our invitation. Thank you.
So, thank you very much, Antonietta, and I would like to thank the Scuola Democratica, University of Cagliari, especially the Faculty of Social and Political Science, and Marco Pizzali, for this kind invitation to present my work. I will be focusing a lot in the French case. I am very sensitive to the fact that, of course, there are significant differences across countries, but I also believe that there are important structural conditions that are affecting our country. So I hope that it resonates with realities in other countries as well. And I will be using part of my work on elites and also part of my most recent work, and I'm writing recently a book on that, which is on policies of widening participation into higher education in the French context. So I have combined both just to present a kind of global overview of some of the barriers, but also opportunities in a market-based meritocracy, and of course I will try to explain this term of market-based meritocracy in my presentation. So first I would like to present very briefly two theoretical models and concepts that I have been using. These are not the only ones, and I also strongly use a Bourdieuian framework, but I don't think I have to present it that much. Some of these models might be very familiar to you or might not be, so I just will do it very briefly. And I very much believe that it's important for us as sociologists, but as social scientists more generally, to go back sometimes to some old frameworks sometimes, but just also to make them contemporary to adapt them to present realities and also to incorporate all new research that has been done. So this is a model that I have used in my research on elites and I keep using. And I also think it's useful to think about widening participation. So it's a very old article now because it's from 1960, an article by Ralph Turner, which was an American interactionist sociologist. And he wrote an article that became very famous on open competition and sponsorship in educational systems. And I thought it was a powerful model to try to understand the French system. In fact, in Turner's original idea, each of these ideal types correspond to one single educational system. So the American system was the open competition and the English system was the sponsorship system. It was immediately criticized because it was like a reductionist approach to each system, and in fact, even at that moment and even more now, I believe that most systems now combine open competition or meritocracy, if you want, which has become the official norm of most of our educational systems, and old and new forms of sponsorship. I also think it's important to include different discussions about the concept. So, for instance, some years later, Jim Rosenbaum, another American sociologist, make it a very crucial distinction, at least for the French context, between inclusive competition and tournament mobility. Because when you read Turner, there is an ambiguity. Most of the article focuses on inclusive competition. So there is competition, but people are not left out. Even if they lose, they continue to be in the system. So it's mostly a kind of inclusive competition. Rosenbaum talks about tournament mobility. It means that at each competition, there is only a certain amount of people that remain. Either the others are totally excluded from the system, or they remain in tracks or in institutions which are less prestigious. And I think this is very important in many systems. Also, in my own work, I make a distinction between institutional sponsorship and family sponsorship. I think Turner only spoke about institutional sponsorship, how the schools were sponsoring certain types of students and not others. But I think families are playing such an important role, as Antoinette mentioned in her introduction. I have written a lot previously on school choice, and school choice is only one of the ways in which families can intervene more in the functioning of educational systems. And the last element that I want to mention is that Turner only focused on traditional sponsorship, and then an American researcher, Eric Brodsky, invented the term of compensatory sponsorship. And he was referring to the affirmative action policies in the US and said this is a kind of compensatory sponsorship, not for the elite, but for a small group of people that are allowed to enter the elite. And I have found that concept useful. So I will be using this model in the presentation of the French system. Then I also have been quite inspired more recently by the work of a colleague and friend, Phil Brown, in the UK. And in his work, he made it clear that it is important in our systems to distinguish three rules of inclusion and exclusion. So we have membership, meritocracy, and market. So membership and meritocracy are very familiar to us, and a lot of the debate in the sociology of education up to now has been there is no true meritocracy, because every time we talk about meritocracy, in fact, there is an embeddedness in membership. For instance, in France, since Bourdieu and other researchers in the 1970s, an ongoing debate about the evaluation criteria used on schools are the cultural criteria of the upper class. So you have a mix of membership and meritocracy. And this, of course, is still going on, but I think it's very important to introduce also the market rules, because of the extension of the market, which has penetrated the educational system much more in the last, let's say, 40 years. So I think it's also important to see how the market rules mix with membership and meritocracy in various ways. And I also use another of the Brown's work, most specific, where he analyzes attitudes of young people towards employment, mostly young people from the upper class who are applying to highly paid jobs. And it is in English, the people he calls the purists and the players. And I have found this distinction useful in my work. To make it simple, the purists are those that play the meritocratic game, and the players are those that are playing the market game. So you have certain elements there. So the purists are, the competition rules for them are about meritocracy. They want work to be an expression of themselves. They want to maintain their self-integrity in jobs, while the players, they are playing the market. They want to win in a positional game. They are willing to go into commodification of self. And the idea about making progress in jobs is to maximize your market. Of course, these are ideal types. And you will find, of course, many young people that are in between. But I think this is also useful to think about the questions I want to raise. So, I now want to move into a quick presentation of the French system, which is very hard, because the French system, but I think most of our systems, if we really go into detail, are very complicated because there is a process of sedimentation. So you have pieces from different periods. So I will try to make it simpler, but I can come back to certain things if you have questions or remarks. So first, I think the French system is very good to understand meritocracy and sponsorship, because I think it has gone very far into a certain model of meritocracy and also maintain and create new forms of sponsorship in the system. So some of the characteristics of the French educational system is that it introduced meritocracy in a much more violent way than in other European countries because of the French Revolution. And it was a radical change in the fact that it was, well, only people who deserved to get the best positions. But because of the violence of the French Revolution, it also meant that there was no inclusiveness. It was really a tournament mobility. So it was very severe selection of the best, because there was so much fear that there would be all kinds of sponsorship. The best had to be selected with examinations, which would be extremely severe. So from the beginning, we had this very strong model of tournament mobility. At the same time, the revolution in education and in all spheres of society did not make disappear many kinds of sponsorship. It would have been wonderful, but it did not happen. So in education, we still kept tracks in education, elite tracks and lower class tracks. There have been a lot of changes, of course, since the French Revolution. I'm going to say a little bit more in a minute. But this institutional sponsorship has remained, and in fact, what we see is a mix of meritocratic and institutional sponsorship. When you still ask teachers in the French context, what is meritocracy for you? The French definition of meritocracy among teachers and among the general population is not everyone should have the chance, etc. But the idea is that everyone should have the chance to go as far as they can. And in fact, the focus is on as far as they can. And of course, those that can go very far are a very happy few. And then you tend to forget all the others because you only focus on those that can go very, very far. And many teachers are totally convinced that they are very meritocratic in applying this principle. But this is a very problematic form of combination of meritocracy and sponsorship, because teacher says we are not sponsoring the upper class, we are sponsoring the best students, so this is a meritocratic competition. But of course, it is very unjust to all the other children and young people. So, institutional sponsorship did not disappear. What has had in France a more ambiguous status than in other countries is family sponsorship. So it was the idea that families had to be kept away from schools because families will be clientelist. So in France, families still have little power to intervene collectively in schools, and that is really a characteristic of the French system. And also, there is a high mistrust of everything that has to do with economic capital. The transmission of cultural capital is perfect. That's the right for every family to transmit its cultural capital to the children. To buy your position in society through money is really looked upon very badly in the French context, and it's very difficult to interrogate people about money, how to use money, etc. But it doesn't prevent money to play a major role. It's just that people don't want to speak about this kind of economic sponsorship in the system. So, I'm not going to go into all the details here. If you have the time, you can read. Just, I want to mention that you can see this combination in the French system of both meritocracy and sponsorship since primary school. In most educational systems, primary schools tend to be very inclusive. That's the most inclusive section of the whole educational system, which is also the case in France. But if you go into the details of how primary schools work, for instance, the French system of grading is extremely severe. And I have been in primary schools where children who are 6-year-old are already graded 1 to 20. And you can get a grade of 9.3 when you are in first grade in primary school, which of course doesn't exist in many systems where you get letters or colors or no grading at all. The French system is very severe from the beginning, and you are always penalized for your mistakes. So even sometimes it's not a very long way past. You could have, even in primary school, a negative grade because all your orthographic mistakes were taken into account, so you could have -10 rather than 10. And also, of course, repeating a grade has been very important in the French system because if you are not at the level, you should repeat and start again. So it's a very severe system, and this is linked to a certain perception of meritocracy, of just selecting the best. At the same time, there is a lot of sponsorship. Because families know that the schools are very severe, you have upper-class families that invest a lot of energy into transmitting their cultural capital to the children. So many upper-class children enter school where they already know how to read, even how to write, etc. Because there is a lot of emphasis on intellectual preparation for the school from the parents. And also there is a lot of institutional sponsorship, and Boudier and Pascal in the book on reproduction use a term which is very adapted to the French system. It says the system is indifferent to differences. So the idea is that we make no differences, and in making no differences, we just take the upper class children succeed better. We make no distinction in the class, but they come ultra prepared to succeed, while the others need some compensatory education to be at the same level, which is not given to them. In secondary education, these processes become much more visible because there are more tests, more exams, so there is more meritocratic competition, and there is also more clear institutional sponsorship because we have abolished tracks in middle secondary school. We still have tracks in upper secondary school, but even in middle secondary school, we have a system of options, and depending on the options you take, it's almost like tracks. And you also have stronger family sponsorship through school choice, through private lessons, so it's a more visible process. And you have different combinations depending on the schools. Marie-Louise, who will be presenting here, as she wrote in a previous article with a colleague, she showed very well class school, you have a system where grading is extremely severe, but transition is very indulgent. And the opposite is true in lower class school. Grades are very indulgent, and transitions are very harsh. So you can get things that combine in different ways if you get into the subtleties of the system, but I'm not going to go into that in my presentation. So, if we move up to higher education, we see that you get again this combination in the French system of tournament mobility, so certain type of meritocracy and institutional sponsorship. So, for instance, the symbol of meritocracy in the French tradition is the concours, and the concours is a specific kind of very competitive examination where you have a set number of places. And this number of places has not grown a lot. For instance, the most famous French grande école is called École Polytechnique. In the 19th century, it had 100 places for students. Today, it has 400 places. So it's still extreme, severe competition to get in. So this is the model of the concours. So tournament mobility is extremely strong. And you have a strong division between the selective track and the non-selective track in access to higher education. And at the same time, institutional sponsorship is very important because access to the more selective tracks depends on getting to preparatory classes, and these preparatory classes are located in certain high schools, in certain lycees, and if you are not there, you are unable to succeed at the concours at the École Polytechnique. And recently, some researchers have done a study of the examination itself. And they have shown that the examination itself, part of the examination of the curriculum of the examination, is only taught in certain preparatory classes. So even if you are the best student, but you are not in the best preparatory classes, your chances of success are very slim because you have not been exposed to the right curriculum. So there is strong institutional sponsorship. And I am recently conducting a research which focuses on family sponsorship, not only on access to higher education, but also on students succeeded in higher education, and especially in the preparatory classes. So we conducted interviews with 32 students and interviews with 27 parents, trying to understand all the things that parents do to have their children succeed in these classes and especially succeed at the concours. And I'm not going into the detail of the research. We have just started to analyze the results at the moment, but what we are showing is that there is still a lot of cultural sponsorship by the parents. Also, the parents cannot help young people anymore directly in many cases because the subjects are too difficult. You are doing mathematics or physics or history at a very, very high level. So unless the parents are specialized in that area, they cannot do. But they still do a lot of cultural discussions and activities. The economic sponsorship is very strong, especially the preparatory classes are located in cities, many of them in Paris. Living in Paris is extremely expensive. Either they live in a family, or if they have an outside apartment, it's very costly for parents to fund that. And of course, there is the living expenses and all the expenses related to it. But we have been more interested into the last two forms of sponsorship, the practical and emotional, because discussing with the parents and particularly with the mothers, you see that most of the mothers spend most of the time, and many of them say that it interferes with their work, that they put their work into parentheses to some extent, at least their career, if not their work, for 2 to 3 years, just to do everything for the children, so all the administrative stuff. They take all the medical appointments. If the children have an apartment outside the home, I have interviewed mothers, they say, I prepare 14 different meals, so the child only puts the meal in the microwave at lunch, at dinner. They don't spend a minute on cooking. And also I have interview mothers, and they say they spend the weekend cleaning the apartment for the children. So this practical thing takes a lot of time and energy, and also the emotional work. It is very hard to succeed. The children are working very hard, and they are completely convinced that it's their own merit. When you interview the students, they say, no, it's only my merit. My parents are not helping me at all. I'm just concentrating on my work. And the parents are, in addition to all the things, they are doing a lot of emotional work. So for instance, they say, I had to cope with the bad humor of my son for 3 years. So it was awful all the time. We had fights. It was terrible because he was failing. He was competing with the others. And there are digressions. My girl, I have to phone her every night just to tell her, no, you are very good. You are going to succeed. It's going to work. So there is very, very strong sponsorship. And of course, these are enormous barriers to other social groups that cannot compete with those that can provide cultural, economic, practical, and emotional sponsorship for the children, which of course requires very specific conditions to do. So the barriers are very high. Of course, I'm really talking about the elite, and if you are talking about other areas in higher education, it's not as important, but I have also finished research on medical students. And the first year in medicine is very competitive because at the end of first year, there is a very hard selection. And we found similar things with the parents and the students we interviewed, that there is very strong family sponsorship. So it's not only the institutions, it's the families as well. So I stop here with meritocracy and sponsorship, and I move now a little bit to the market. So the introduction of the market logic in the French system. So I think the French system has resisted a lot to the market penetration, and there has been a lot of writing by political scientists, sociologists, showing the specific forms that this has taken in the French context, especially with no public announcement about this, not making it like a strong political discourse on the market. But anyway, the market has penetrated in many invisible ways into all spheres of social life and education as well. So what I call a market-based meritocracy has a lot to do with the fact that even though the French definition of meritocracy is still totally embedded into this membership into the cultural upper class, with the cultural categories of the upper class, it is now slowly moving towards incorporated other categories that also come from upper class groups, but not necessarily the same. So here we have a new view of merit, which is not focusing only on scholastic merit, but more on what sociologists like Boltanski and Chapelot have called the new spirit of capitalism. So these soft skills, enterprising mindset, strategic skills, flexibility, adaptability. So these are new concepts that are penetrating the definition of merit, first of all by employers, of course, but then it has moved on into higher education and the way in which students are selected into higher education institutions is incorporating these new elements. For instance, the introduction of statement letters to apply to higher education institutions, which is something new, relatively new in the French context. It is becoming much more common at the moment. And the private schools are developing much more this kind of education of preparing children into this. So there is this new market-based meritocracy, which is still competing with the old meritocracy and all kinds of combinations. And also there is what we can call a market-based sponsorship, if I would refer to the sponsorship model. First, because some of the functions that were played by public institutions, like these preparatory classes in the public sector, now are taken over a little bit by private institutions, and also because of the development of new private services I talked about private lessons, but it can be also private coaching, etc. So that's developing as well. And parents are also using more private schools and higher education institutions and resorting to private service. So there is a combination of the old model of the elitist model and this new form of market-based meritocracy and so in my work, I'm interested at the two extremes, how these changes are affecting both the upper classes and the lower classes. Because, of course, these are structural changes in society, but their effects are not the same depending on which groups we're considering. So, in the upper classes, in France, I believe more than in other countries, there has been always a tension, a stronger division, and a big tension between the cultural fraction and the economic fraction of the upper class. Probably because the cultural fraction is larger than in other countries. We also have this political model of the intellectual, which is like a kind of ideal figure for the cultural elite. We also have a large public sector where this cultural fraction works, so it's wider than in other countries, where there is more a mix. I discuss a lot with some American colleagues, and I keep telling them that they don't have the same type of cultural fraction. So although they have professionals who are more similar to the French cultural elite, there is much more mix between the economic and the cultural fraction than in the French context. So what is happening now, very simple, is that for a long time the cultural fraction was socially dominated, and Bourdieu talked a lot about this, both in Distinction and in his book on the Grande École, the noblesse d'État, the state nobility, but the cultural fractions were still dominant in the school. It was the criteria of the cultural fractions that were imposed. It was the legitimate culture of the school, was the culture of the cultural fraction of the upper class. This, as I said, is changing now, with this tendency to introduce the soft skills, which are much more aligned with the interest of the economic fraction. It hasn't happened completely. We cannot say the economic fraction has won, and there is a lot of tension. For instance, in universities, there is a tension between the managers who have adopted many of these views of the market and the academics who are defending the traditional elitist model of the cultural fraction. So it is much more a much complex landscape. And in the lower classes, there are changes as well. It is not simple that the lower classes are now doubly dominated. They are dominated by the elitist model and they are dominated by the market model, which is true. There is still an imposition of another way of reproducing dominance. But at the same time, in the same way that some working class children manage to go through the meritocratic system because they adapted the cultural model of the upper class and they could move up into the system. Now we have lower class children who are becoming players, if I talk as Phil Brown. They are adopting this market form, and I am interested in who are these students, what is happening to them, etc. And so this is the last part of my presentation about what is happening with these lower class students under this very complex regime that I have been trying to describe, unfortunately, very quickly. So I'm going to talk about these new opportunities for children, and to do this, I'm going to focus on the work I have been doing for the last 12 years on the program of my own institution. So I'm going to try to show that we are now into a combination of elitist and neoliberal regimes of educational opportunity. So at the same time, at a certain level, we can say nothing has changed, because either in the elitist regime or in the neoliberal regime, there is what sociologist and historian Charles Tilly called opportunity hoarding by the upper class. So the opportunities are strongly controlled by the upper class in each case, and there is only a very limited number of opportunities for the others, and especially for the lower class too. But, as I said before, the way in which this tiny group of lower class students can move up in society through education is changing, with differences between the elitist regime and the neoliberal regime in the types of things that are rewarded by the system, as I said, in the elitist regimes, the cultural properties and cultural loyalty to the system, and in the neoliberal regime is more about the soft skills and loyalty to the market. And also, the way to get there is different. In the elitist regime is more how to get into the elite track for the lower class children, and in this neoliberal regime is more how you can get access to opportunity niche that are offered for the students within the system, and how you can get access to some opportunity markets in the system. So, this is just to remind you that there are different types of compensatory sponsorships. I already mentioned the more radical one is affirmative action. In the French context, affirmative action is like politically impossible in the sense that you cannot discriminate positively on the basis of race or etc. So there is no idea that there is going to be a kind of affirmative action. So the program I'm going to describe is more that we can talk about indirect preferential treatment, where we use apparently neutral criteria to advantage disadvantaged groups. And traditionally in the French context, this has taken the form of developing partnerships with disadvantaged schools, because it's okay to positively discriminate schools. It's not okay to positively discriminate specific types of students, especially on the basis of ethno-racial characteristics. So this program I'm going to describe refers to indirect preferential treatment. There are also a lot of outreach programs. These programs are quite cheap. They are very popular. They don't change anything radically in the system, because it just provides some kind of additional information, some scholarships, some help, but it hasn't changed the landscape. In fact, there has been a lot of statistical data recently, and this program, this outreach program, have not changed at all the landscape of elite education. This program that I'm going to describe in more detail now has been debated a lot, because it's the most radical program in the French context, and although it concerns a very small number of students, at least it has the merit that the intention of the program is really to integrate the students into some school, my institution. It's not just tutoring and all kinds of outreach activities. So the program was introduced, I'm not going to go into the details of how it was introduced, and frequently it's the case as a combination of local factors and political factors. In French educational policy, political factors are very important, and I will say that a major factor in the introduction of the program has been the French fragments concerning riots. You know, we have regular riots in the banlieue, in the periphery, and this program coincided with these riots, and they just have to do something to these students in the banlieue to stop the riots, something that is not just the police, but we have to do something in education. So I'm not going to, because I don't have time, I'm not going to go into the scheme conception and design, just to tell you that the scheme is based on the idea of partnerships with disadvantaged schools, and then students, they prepare a press report in their disadvantaged schools, they defend the press report with a jury in the school, and they are deemed admissible or not in the local school, and then those that are admissible go on to an interview at Sciences Po, and if they succeed at the interview, then they are admitted at Sciences Po. So I'm interested in what goes on in the whole process, and the book focuses on the whole process. So what is interesting is we have been doing a lot of work in the workshops in the secondary schools that prepare the students for the process, and it's interesting to see that some teachers are really still doing the kind of classical work of saying these students, we have to give them more cultural capital, so they are providing them with visits to museums, more readings, etc. And all the secondary schools are playing the market and say we're just preparing these tools of how to market themselves, first for the admission interview and then for later in their life. They have to learn how to market themselves. Also, we did work with the admission process at Sciences Po, and it has changed recently in 2020, but before 2020 you had an admission jury that was composed of someone from the business sector frequently, an academic, and someone from the administration from Sciences Po. And it was very interesting to observe the process, and we also did a lot of interviews with members of the jury. So the academics were defending a very elitist cultural view of what merit is. And then you had the businessmen with all these market views of what was the good student to be admitted at Sciences Po. And so some of the students who got admitted were more market-like, and some were extremely meritocratic students, according to the classic definition of merit. Because I don't have that much time, I will just go to my last slide. I'm interested in the student objective trajectory, but because I am a qualitative researcher, and I am also other colleagues who have done more work on statistical data, on what is happening to these students. Unfortunately, Sciences Po has kept no record of what happened to them in the labor market. So I found 42 graduates, who I don't know at all how representative they are of all students who graduated, but we do have a lot of statistical data now about what happens within the institutions and in the admission process. I'm more interested as a qualitative researcher in the effect on young people's subjectivities. And what I have been trying to show in my research is that how this process can be conceived both as a classical process of compensatory sponsorship, but also as a process of learning to be part of the market, because the whole process, in a sense, was not, of course, explicitly conceived as such, but it has functioned as such. So many students who started as being very meritocratic students at the beginning, because otherwise they would not have been selected to be part of the program, they very quickly learned that to be admitted in the process, they also had to play the market. So they started to develop more market-like attitudes. They will videotape in their schools to see if they were able to present themselves in an effective way, etc. Afterwards, they go to Sciences Po. The first 3 years are extremely classical, like very cultural elitist training. But then the last 2 years are really the professional masters, and really who are already in the market and they're preparing in this masters. So you see how students change over time. They also change because even during the first bachelor years, they go to associations, and part of the experience, and perhaps the most important part of the experience, is going to these associations, the social capital to build the associations, cultural capital to build there. So they learn also to become players there. So more and more they have this kind of mixed embodied capital. And then I interview these students who are graduates and how they fare in the labor market. And I'm trying to understand the trajectories and the experiences, and those that really only play the meritocratic game, and they find specific problems in the sense that they don't have the culture generale. They are always thought that they would not have this culture generale that has the French upper class, and they are not as meritocratic. But also those that play the game of the market, also they have difficulties in the labor market, both because many times people are suspicious that they are fake, and that's really a problem for them. It's not their true self, it's that they are fake, and also because really playing the market, and I am very much aware of the work of Sam Friedman and Lois in the UK, is that these students can get in the market, but move up in the market becomes very difficult for them, because to move up in the market is that they don't have the economic capital and the social capital that is really necessary to be part of the economic overland in the French country. So I just stop here. It's very open to your remarks, because as you could see, it's just work in progress, and I'm very willing if we have time to discuss it with you. Thank you.